Our second reading today comes to us from Paul's letter to the Romans. It is found in Romans chapter 13. It begins with verse 8 and goes through verse 13 or 14. Please listen for the word of God. Owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Besides this, you know what time it is, how it is already the moment for you to wake from sleep. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we became believers. The night is far gone, the day is near. Let us then throw off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us walk decently, as in the day, not in reveling and drunkenness, not in illicit behavior and licentiousness, not in quarreling and jealousy. Instead, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provisions for the flesh to gratify its desires. This is the word of the Lord. If you have known me for a long time, you know that this particular text, one particular piece of this text, has followed me my entire ministry. The first time I ever read this particular passage of Romans was at my brother-in-law's funeral after he was shot and killed, when my sister asked me to give his eulogy. I often tell that story because the way I found the text was very random. I basically opened the Bible and there it was. While I was looking for something to say to a bunch of people who were asking me a lot of questions about why God lets this happen and why there is so much evil in the world and how could I possibly follow a faith that allows this to happen. But the only part of the passage I read at the funeral was this: the night is far gone, the day is near. Let us then throw off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Even as I said it then, I knew that the words would become a central theme in my own faith, and so my ministry has been devoted to the idea that violence has no place in church or society. And I mean all violence: spiritual violence, physical violence, verbal violence, emotional violence, all of it. But it was not until after the dust had settled and the family trauma had started to recede a bit, and we had all calmed down, that I started to look at the passage in its larger sort of context, right? Of course, I know what came after the words I read at the funeral, and there's a reason I didn't read them, because they annoy me. So here we go. Paul follows that, of course, with this let us walk decently stuff, right? Not in drunkenness and not in illicit sexual behavior and licentiousness and quarreling and jealousy. And I mean, there it is, right? Policeman Paul, morality police, telling you what you can and cannot do. But there is something fully tragic about the idea that we try to reduce Paul to this kind of moralist who just walked around monitoring personal behavior as though he was God's personal police of your bedrooms and your homes, right? That Paul was somehow obsessed with the minute human behaviors, right? Yes, Paul said a lot of things that sounded pretty darn judgy, and I will not try to excuse that. And yes, Paul says things that are problematic, and I'm not going to try to excuse that either. But in many ways, I think when we try to create Paul as this kind of petty moralist, we might be doing a little bit of projection, right? Projecting our own moral absolutes where they don't really belong. At our worst, at our absolute worst, Paul's words are used to hurt and judge and condemn and divide. My advice to you is to stop doing that. Paul was speaking to real people, facing real problems, in a real moment, in a real history. Paul was not pondering theological theory as he was doing his work. He was trying to make faith a real, practical, and active thing. Paul saw a people around him who were descending and declining and dividing. Paul saw cultural shifts. Paul saw cultures rise and fall. Paul was responding to the truth of his moment in many ways. But in this particular passage, Paul was also speaking to us about the truth of the second coming of Christ. Paul called it imminent. Is it? I don't know. Maybe we should act like it, though. I used to have a very negative view of the idea of morality. In fact, I used to tell people, you cannot define it as a word, it is pointless, stop using it. Because morality is kind of a nebulous thing. It is hard to define, it is prone to change, and sometimes it is culturally specific. Sometimes it's even situational. But that's the aha moment, right? Yes, morality is a huge, nebulous, hard to define thing. It is complicated, it's hard to pin down. Of course it is. It's enormous. And of course, Paul knew that too. The idea that Paul walked around in some black and white sort of moral absolutism is ridiculous. And I bet Paul may have read more than one prophet in Paul's life. And Paul was probably well acquainted with the prophetic framework of morality. Prophets viewed morality and behavior not just through the lens of the individual, but through a larger and more complex lens. Prophets spoke of moral decline as a community issue, a corporate decline in morality, often linked to a weak and corrupt leadership. The moral compromise of leaders trickling down into the moral compromise of the people. Corruption and injustice trickling down from broken priests and broken princes. It is a sometimes subtle thing, at least until it isn't anymore. I recently have been doing some thinking because I've been reading a lot about the papacy during World War II. And so I've been obsessed with reading about that sort of point in history. And rather than go into some long, lengthy history, I'm not going to do that. One of the things that struck me as I was sort of diving into it are the trade-offs. The trade-offs that churches make in order to stay safe, in order to be protected from some perceived danger. Paul viewed the problems in our lives as problems of excess. Drunkenness is an excessive behavior. Promiscuity is an excessive behavior. By the way, the word that's used for promiscuity in this passage also translates to couch. Do with that what you will. Paul saw these things, right, as symptoms of a culture that is turning in on itself, a culture that is beginning to decline. Paul saw all of it as a kind of dark rabbit hole of abusive, in sort of intemperate, potentially violent behavior, moral trade-offs. Paul saw that whether it's the temple or whether it's the king, society begins a process of accepting certain immoralities and injustices as normal. Communal corruption, then, the community and political rationalizations that we begin to use to excuse our bad behavior, our violence, our injustice, our hate, become the same excuses that individuals use in their individual lives to explain away the same kinds of violence and hate and intolerance. They become our rationalizations for personal violence. We hear Paul using words like drunkenness and illicit behavior, adultery, licentiousness, quarreling, jealousy, and we want to assign them to other individual people specifically for the purposes of judgment, as though Paul was condemning your alcoholic neighbor or your cousin who's a little too friendly to some eternal hell because of their individual behavior, as though your impure thought or your envy or your jealousy determines the fate of human civilization. It's a little self-involved, if you ask me. As though some individual bad act happens in a vacuum. Am I my brother's keeper? What Paul is telling us with this passage is more than just, let's be people of light. Paul is suggesting here that we have something that we have been pretending we don't have for a very long time now. We have agency. We have agency that makes us part of a larger morality, a larger light. Paul, for all his moral talk, understood that the darkness of our collective corruption is the same darkness then as it is now. It's the same darkness it has always been, and it begins with moral trade-offs. One trade-off lets us reject or hate or kill people that we don't like or accept because clearly they're enemies to God or they're enemies to us. The people we fear must be destroyed, and God's okay with that. Or at least if God's not okay with it, we have to do it this one time. We'll get through it. It's a trade-off. And the next trade-off comes, and it tells us that maybe some violence is permitted in service of safety or in service of national security or in service of God knows what. Most often in service of the illusion of safety. And then comes the trade-off that says the needs and accomplishments of the individual outweigh the needs of the many. It is okay in this moral trade-off to see ourselves as us and them. Violence and selfishness, these are the children of human excess. These moral trade-offs lead us to a culture in which one person can decide that his needs in one moment outweigh the needs, for example, of a mother and her 3 children to have a husband and a father. This is the trade-off that leads the same person to believe that his personal needs are more important than the employees that he will traumatize with his actions, or the entire community of family and friends that will be left weeping and grieving in the aftermath of one selfish choice. One person believing that self is supreme and believing that violence is acceptable and a normal way to satisfy the self punched a hole into the lives of my family and let the darkness in. That is disorienting. It is disorienting for anybody, and believe I was not a minister. I was a new baby Christian at the time. To face real evil with a faith that is not quite settled sucks. And person after person, knowing my interest in religion and my Christian faith, kept asking me why. Why does God let this happen? Why did God let this? Why does God shoot people? This, friends, is when you need the armor of light. Or perhaps the armor of light is something we're supposed to be wearing all the time. But the point is this, right? Paul spoke with urgency. My family met that urgency face to face. Paul is calling us not just to talk in high and lofty terms about these ideas of light and darkness. Paul is asking us to reject the things that lead to darkness. Paul is suggesting that we should reject selfishness as a way of living, that we should reject extremism as a way of believing, that we should reject excess as a way of collecting, and that we should reject the idea that any person of faith can make moral trade-offs in service of power or money, or God help us, just plain old selfishness. Paul is telling us in this passage that it is time to stop normalizing the darkness. It is time to stop justifying the darkness. It is time to cast aside the petty jealousies and the petty feuds and all the petty things that we use to judge and destroy and hurt and divide, to recognize the corrupting power of a life lived only to satisfy the appetites of the individual, the fleshy, worldly appetites of one person. I believe strongly that Paul was not a petty man. I believe Paul's problem was not to run around and pick out all the petty little things that we were doing wrong, and I would like us to stop treating faith like a petty thing. We are not living in a petty time or a petty place. We are living in a serious time, and we are living in a serious place, and we have serious problems, and we need serious people to deal with them. But our problems are not found in the look or behavior of your neighbors. Our problems are not found in the needs of the poor or the needs of the marginalized. Our problems are not that they need things. Our problem is that we don't care. Our problem is that we have been told that the needs of the individual must be paramount. You can't have nice stuff because a bunch of brown people are taking it from you. And you can't have nice stuff because there are too many transgender people in the world. And you can't have nice stuff because your poor neighbor is living on the system. It is a short journey from selfishness to violence, a very short journey. And I think Paul is asking us not just to look at our personal behavior, of course you should, but to look at us as a larger collective of people and ask ourselves, what are we doing? Are we a people of light? Are we a people of dark? Are we a people willing to set aside the things that cause this darkness and put on the things that actually stop it? I spoke to a room of people about the armor of light because I believe that we are the armor of light. I believe that the church has a role in the life of humanity to bring light into it. I believe that the armor of light is what we wear in life every single day, and whether or not we choose to shine that light is up to us. God is not a God of violence. God doesn't shoot people. People do. Evil does. Selfishness does. Pain and trauma do. A lot of things pull triggers, but God is not one of them. And as we face a nation descending into its own violence, we saw it. We saw bombers in the middle of the night dropping bombs on another country. I don't care how you feel about it. The point is, it's a violent act. And that violence trickles down. We all remember the Columbine shooting, right? The Columbine shooting that brought mass gun violence into our consciousness in many ways. Do you know what else happened that day? The U.S. dropped more raw tonnage of explosives on another nation than any time in the conflicts that led for that decade. I don't think that's a stretch. I don't think that that's not connected. We, on a mass scale, have decided that violence is a way to create peace. That somehow weapons encourage us to be nicer to each other. As though fear is real peace. And so in our streets, we now have people running around every day. Last night, as those bombs were dropping, at the exact same moment, almost, 2 mass shootings happened at the same time. In 2 different places, at 2 different Juneteenth celebrations. 2 people are dead and 11 people injured because of those shootings. I see a connection. I see a connection between a permissive state of violence and a culture that begins to permit it. I see the trickle down of darkness here. I see the idea that we have decided that toughness or some illusion of masculinity is more important than feminizing ourselves by talking about peace or negotiation or compromise. We're supposed to be warriors and tough guys, right? I heard it in the news conference all this morning. Warriors, 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 tough, 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 right? We see it in the Middle East all over. Massive numbers of people dying every day. And we think that doesn't affect our children? We think that doesn't affect our consciousness? We think that doesn't affect our morality? It does. And so I call upon the church, everyone in the church, To begin the work of putting on this armor of light, and whatever that means to you, it means to you. But what it means is this. It means that we don't believe that violence is an answer. It means that we don't believe that war is a thing that people should do. It means that we do not believe that violence is natural or inevitable. It means that we do not believe that hate and racism and division and sexism and homophobia and transphobia, all these things that are currently tearing at the fabric of our unity, we don't believe they're problems. We believe they're opportunities. We believe they are the things that make us stronger as a church and as a people. We believe as Presbyterians in the democratic ideas that create freedom, in the democratic ideas that promote the freedom to speak and the freedom to worship and the freedom to report the news. We believe in those things. We believe in them very deeply because we helped to make them. We believe violence is a sin. There's a period after that. I don't add any caveats. We believe war is a sin. Killing other human beings is a sin. What happened to my brother-in-law was a sin. It was sin made action. The antidote to this is not for us to engage in more sin. The antidote to this is not for us to meet violence with violence, or eyes for eyes, or teeth for teeth. Our solutions are not found in war and bombs and guns. They never have been. And for all the people who want to say that this is a completely ridiculous stance, that I am somehow naive and Pollyannish, I would suggest that the response to that is, we have never tried it any other way. How do you know? And so I don't know what the point of what I'm saying today is, except to say that I believe the church has something to say, has something to do in this moment, and that is to shine this light. To shine the light that exposes truth, the light that critiques us, but also the light that liberates us, the light that lifts us, the light that brings out the best of us. I believe that light is there. I believe it's been there since God breathed breath into your body, and I believe you cannot ever shed it. And I don't know of a single moment in my lifetime where it has become abundantly clear in this way that our resistance must happen now. That our resistance is a resistance of light. Our resistance is a resistance of exposing truth. Our resistance is a resistance of praising the God of peace and demanding nonviolent civil society. And our resistance is to stand up to all of the forces that tell us that this is inevitable, that this must happen, and say no, say enough, say not now, not ever. I believe that we have a serious violence problem. I believe it's getting worse every day. I believe that the politicians are no longer capable of doing anything about it. And so I believe it is the church that must rise up and say, enough. It is the church, it is Christians who must wear the mantle of God's light and say that peace is possible. I believed it when I spoke the words of Paul to the largest crowd I have ever preached to at my brother-in-law's funeral. I believed it when I said it to the people who asked me why. I believe it happened because we let it happen. And I believe it's time to stop. And so I am asking us to stop treating Paul like a petty, moralizing maniac, and to start understanding that what he is saying to us are foundational things about who we are as faithful people. To understand that what Paul was trying to do is the same thing we are trying to do: make sense of something. Find a way for the church to respond to that something, and then do it. Your neighbors are not your problem. They are your responsibility. Your neighbors don't cause your problems. I don't understand. I will never understand why this is so hard. Why loving a neighbor costs so much to us or seems so difficult to us. And I want to tell you this: every single time we choose light over dark, every single time we choose love over hate, every single time we choose peace over violence, the world changes. And the trajectory changes. And the journey changes. You, as individual people, have the power to make that change now. The question is, will we cast off finally the ways of darkness? And will we, as a collective people, once again wear proudly the armor of light? It's your move now. Amen.